Okay, let's talk about how the Grizzly Direwolf Stormwolf build actually works. Now, you're going to notice something while I'm doing this, which is that Tornado is costing me 0 spirit. I have a combination of items that make it where Grizzly Rage does multiple things for me. One, it's going to consistently ramp my damage, meaning my single target, like you saw in the intro clip, will be completely hilarious. It also gives me hilarious movement speed, so I can move very, very fast. It also gives me infinite castable tornadoes, because while I'm in the Grizzly form, Grizzly Rage Dire Werewolf form from the aspect I'm about to show you, it also reduces the cost of spirits for me to 0%. It makes everything free to cast. So I get everything within Grizzly Rage, and that's what the build is about. So let me start explaining how this actually works. Now, the weapon is probably the first important one to start with. Grizzly Rage now shapeshifts you into a Dire Werewolf. Now, I have this on a 2-hand, so it's double stats, which gets it up to 100% spirit cost reduction, meaning when I go into Grizzly Rage, I can spam literally infinitely. Now, we do pair this with the Earthen Might. You don't have to pair with Earthen Might, but I am. This will give us guaranteed critical strike chance with our lucky hit, as well as refill our spirit, effectively making it where when we drop out of Grizzly Rage, then we can have some spirit there to use in between Grizzly Rages. Now, because Grizzly Rage is so important, cooldown reduction for this build is going to be very important, but also the duration of Grizzly Rage extension aspect of Rampaging Werebeast is going to be very important, because this one is the one that makes critical strikes increase our critical strike damage. So obviously the passive of Earthen Might guaranteeing critical strikes now is going to be very good with Grizzly Rage. Now, reading this, you might say that's for Earth skills. Well, on the gloves, we're actually using the Sovereign Van Braces, which makes it where Earthen Might also works for Storm skills. Now, the reason that Tornado is both a Storm as well as Werewolf skill is because the helmet that we have, Tempest Roar, makes it where your Storm skills are now also Werewolf skills. So while we're in the Dire Werewolf form, we can still cast the Tornadoes. Now, the rest of these aspects are either for increased damage or survivability. The Tornado here is the other important one for this. Tornado will seek up to 3 targets at max, but I only have a bad roll of 1. It took me 8 hours just to get this one. I stayed up all night for the video, unfortunately. So you're going to want that at a better roll, which effectively makes the Tornadoes auto-homing, which is important for things like the single target damage you saw on the boss. Without that, the Tornadoes will fuck off in their own direction and be a giant waste of time. The chest plate I'm using is Mad Wolf's Glee, permanently making me a werewolf and increasing physical damage. Little known fact, Tornado is actually physical damage. You can see it at the bottom. So for that reason, increasing physical damage through the chest plate is actually quite good, as well as we get the 2+ ranks of werewolf skills, which Tornado is in fact a werewolf skill now because of the Tempest Roar helmet. So this is actually a very good synergy. Now, there's a couple other things in this build that are interesting. For instance, Temerity. What Temerity does is when I'm healing beyond 100% life, I am granted a barrier. Now, if we go back to what we actually look at here with the Grizzly Rage, you can see the Grizzly Rage shapeshifts you into a Dire Werewolf, so I get movement speed, I get the 100 spirit cost reduction as I was explaining, but I also get 10% heal of my max HP from getting a kill, which means that can be thrown into the barrier and actually continually increase our barrier. Now, if you look at Spirit Boons, critical strikes will heal me 3%. Again, this will go into barrier with Temerity, meaning we're going to have a barrier a lot of the time. Now, one of the things I have on my amulet is my core skill damage is increased from Fortify. I actually think I'd probably prefer my skill damage is increased by having a barrier, or you can actually add that in addition if you want to swap with like a one-hand and offhand. I do think offhand would be quite good with this build. It's probably even better than the two-hand. It would be okay to reduce the 100% and put this on an amulet, so it's like a 75% spirit cost reduction, and that would actually be fine because it would pair very well with the Paragon board that spending, where is it here, that actually spinning spirit deals increased damage, so being able to have the ability to spend some spirit while keeping your spirit up actually wouldn't be bad literally anyway. So I do think it's probably better to have a one-hand and an offhand, and you can either add the bonus of adding that barrier damage in there as well, or there's also the argument that you could put attack speed in here. Now, I have a little bit of attack speed through swooping attacks, because attack speed is going to increase the speed at which we can actually throw the tornadoes, and because I basically have infinite tornadoes, having more attack speed means I'm getting more damage over time with the tornadoes. So that's effectively the layout of how this works. And then the boots leave a trail of frost that chills enemies, and I deal with increased damage to chilled enemies. Now, this is the only boot I could find that would help me actually increase my damage, because the boots you can't have offensive aspects on, but this unique here, Pentient Greaves, gives me 9% additional damage through a cheese tactic of basically having people chilled. So that's the aspects that I'm currently working with here. Now, in terms of skills, let me show you how I have broken it down with skills. Starting from the top, I'm using Storm Spike. This gives us damage reduction. It keeps us from being overly squishy. And I'm going up to the vulnerabilities. Vulnerability is important, even though we do have vulnerability in glyphs. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But for uptime on vulnerability for bosses, this is quite important. Now, as we go down here, I'm taking core skills, cost more but increased damage. Tornado is a core skill, so obviously that's important. I'm doing maximum spirit increase because we're getting our spirit filled by the key passive we'll talk about in just a moment. Obviously, Tornado, taking vulnerability with Tornado. You could also go slow. I am preferring the vulnerability at the moment. Increase critical stance for close. Movement speed in werewolf form because we are always a werewolf because of the items I have mentioned here. Cyclone armor with the increased cyclone armor damage reduction, and I want the double damage reduction because I am quite squishy. Then we're going to have Blood Howl as well. The only thing that's keeping us, speaking of being squishy, from dying is the temerity with the barrier and the heals. So temerity is actually quite good because of the heals. Now, I do take elemental exposure, and I do take durations of hurricane. I don't think you have to take these at all, to be honest. These are kind of just additional points that I have laying around that I'm not too worried about. I do take the attack speed from the Blood Howl, by the way, because I think attack speed, like I mentioned earlier, is quite important. I take all of these because poison enemies are slowed. Poison enemies take additional damage. You might be wondering where the poison's coming from. What's coming from this one, which critical strikes with werewolf skills deal their base damage as poison. And keep in mind, Tornado will count as a werewolf skill. So they're getting poisoned, which slows them, which counts as crowd control. So when we have things like bonus crowd control, damage to slowed enemies, damage to crowd control enemies, that right there, that passive will actually allow all of those to now proc. And it also allows us to deal more damage to poison enemies and allows us to use poison enemies damage increase if we end up getting that on a weapon. Now I'm taking Nature Magic skill damage increase because Tornado is also Nature Magic, and I'm taking the Consume the Spirit by 3%. We'll do a heal because of the way that Temerity works, as well as this is our effectively keeping up our HP. So I need the Temerity barrier to come from that, which is once again why I think the barrier damage increase could be quite good. Obviously, this is a Grizzly Rage build, so we're going to be using Grizzly Rage all the way, and then Earthen Might because of the gloves I've mentioned where your Storm skills will actually proc Earthen Might. So I'm just going to open up a dungeon here. Let us do a 43. All right, so here we're in the dungeon, and I'll just do some gameplay and kind of explain it as we go. So effectively, we have really, really ridiculous movement speed because of all our movement speed bonuses. And once we use the ultimate, it's going to be even better. We're going to use Hurricane, which will help us ramp the critical strike damage, give us slow, give us the vulnerability as well, which we already have because of the Paragon boards. And we'll go over the Paragon boards in just a moment here. And you can kind of see that it works pretty decently. One of the things we desperately need is a triple roll in terms of Tornado Seeking. This ring right here is a single target ring, so our AoE damage is a little bit lackluster. And now that the Grizzly Rage has fallen off, we do have some spirit still left available because we had no spirit cost during the actual Grizzly Rage. And now we can spam here once again. Try not to get CC because the only unstoppable we have is from Grizzly Rage. Then we Grizzly Rage once again, and then we are back to having lots of damage, and we can just blow through this no problem. So for me personally, I've been quite satisfied with both the trash mob clear. As you can see, it is quite good. And I've also been satisfied, obviously, with the single target boss DPS. Now, I'd like to state this build is not finished being min-maxed. I do not believe I have it 100% correct, but in theory, it is getting there. If you look at the Paragon board, I think the Paragon board has some improvements left to be made, but I do believe vulnerability is going to be a very important glyph. I also believe if you look at the glyphs that Storm skill damage, damage reduction from vulnerable enemies will be good as well. The synergy is obvious between the two of them. Then using core skill damage increase with Fang and Claw, I think will be very important. And then looking at this where damage while in werewolf form and damage reduction with the werewolf glyph will be very important. The boards that I choose to use are Thunderstruck for an increased critical strike against vulnerable enemies. Again, the obvious synergy. We have many forms of vulnerability. We have the core damage, which is under the ancestral guidance for after spinning spirit, you deal increased damage. So we can do that in between having Grizzly Rage up. This is why I think there's optimizations left to be in the build. actually not spending spirit with a perfect row could actually be a bad thing because we're losing 30% increased damage during Grizzly Rage. So I do think that we could probably move this perfect row, and I have another perfect row in here. We can move this to the amulet and then go with a one hand and a offhand. I believe in theory that would be better, but I do not have the aspects currently available. And then from there, I've got the maximum spirit increase, taking things like core skill damage, etc. there. Obviously, we have the increased critical strike damage there. Critical strike with werewolves will restore spirit as well. We're getting a lot of critical strikes, as you saw on the boss. The damage over time is significant because it's just constantly twirling on somebody. So because of that, you're going to more or less always have spirit, and then that allows you to take things like werewolf skill damage, critical strike damage, you know, all these types of things within these boards. So the board could be min-maxed a little bit better, but in theory, you can kind of see what I'm working with there. I think the Paragon board is pretty obvious once you understand how the build works. And I think temerity with the barrier increase is something that I still have to make the build better, but there's definitely something to it. I think it is probably better, honestly, than the pulverized build, especially when you get it 100% min-maxed, and I will do an update when it gets 100% min-maxed. But for right now, it's definitely something there. Consider liking the video or subscribing to see more Druid-related content as well as other Diablo 4 videos, and I will see you on the live streams.